I think I said last week that we would go ahead and continue into the next lesson, and that meant dropping one point and just moving on to make it nice and tidy that at the beginning of a class period we get to start this. But in looking back over it this week, I really didn't want to stop. I didn't want to drop that last point because I think there is a very important point to be made. So this is the kind of the second half of us considering ourselves as strangers and aliens. Specifically, the points that we've looked at is what does it mean to live life as a stranger and an alien. We discussed trusting in God's promises. We also discussed obeying God's instructions, because obviously if we hear it, kind of thinking about the lesson, if God's communicating it to us, then it does no good if we don't what? If we don't live it, if we don't act on it. Then there's also coming out from the world. We had a nice discussion of John chapter 17, verses 10 through 15, of the difference between being in the world but not of the world. When you look in John chapter 17, if you weren't in that for that discussion, John 17, 10 through 15, Jesus doesn't say it in so many words, but the idea is definitely expressed in those words. The idea of being in the world but not being of the world. Then we talked a little bit about delaying gratification. What did delaying gratification mean? What point was there to that? Delaying gratification. Right. And throughout this whole lesson of living as strangers and aliens, Abraham and Sarah have kind of been the main people to which we kind of get the inspiration for the lesson. And they had to delay their gratification. So we understand that as we're trying to live in the world but not be of the world, that the ultimate reward to that isn't something that's going to come immediately. In fact, it not only might it not be a reward, it may actually be what? What might we have to put up with because we're trying to be godly people? Lots and lots of abuse. It's remarkable when you start looking at other Christians in the world, and thankfully now, at least because of social media, we get some kind of snapshots of what that's like. You have people who live in, say, communist countries, and the teaching and preaching in China is actually pretty strong, considering what point? That it's kind of sort of illegal. There are many men who labor in African countries, and I'm just going to give you an example. The southern part of it will be quote-unquote Christian. The northern part of the nation will be Muslim. So if you live kind of close to that meridian, and not all of them are like that, but that's just an example, then you could be preaching the New Testament principles, but really suffer for it because of what's all around you. And that's just two illustrations. But people who are faithful understand that commitment, or understand that gratification is sometimes delayed. So this last one is commitment. And this is the one that I thought about maybe us just going ahead and skipping, because it seems like we understand the concept of commitment, but I really just had one kind of laser focus point to make. Let's look in Hebrews chapter 10 and verses 34 and 35. So what does Hebrews chapter 10? Someone read Hebrews chapter 10, verses 34 through 35 for us. Can you imagine what it would have been like to actually listen to the apostles? Can you imagine what it would have been like to actually listen to Jesus? Can you imagine what it would have been like to travel with Paul? Because we look back on those times and we kind of wistfully think, if I were in that situation, you would have never had to have worried about what with me? You'd have never had to worry about me being a believer. You wouldn't have worried about me being committed to it. You wouldn't have had to worry about me going off and committing sin. I mean, if I were in the presence of those righteous people, man, I would have been on the straight and the narrow. But I want you to think about one person. In Colossians, and he's only mentioned twice in the New Testament, and so therefore we almost have no information at all about him. But we have enough to make this point. In Colossians chapter 4, someone read for us verse 14. Colossians chapter 4, reading in verse 14. Which of those two do you think I want to talk about? Demas. Okay. Now, when was Colossians written? When was Colossians written? And it's okay to guess because honestly all we can do is guess. AD 61 or 62. So keep that number in your mind, AD 61 or AD 62. Now let's go to the other place, the only other place where Demas is mentioned, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 10. And someone read verse 10. When was 2 Timothy written? Okay, again, all we can do is guess. Probably written around 66 or 67. How much difference were there between the two of them? 5 years. 5 years. My point is this. Guys, it can happen that fast. And especially for all of you, I still want to say all of us, but I'm not in the us anymore. For all of you who are still raising your children. They can be sophomores in high school and everything can look fantastic. Fast forward 5 years, which would put them into year 2 of college, and what can happen? Everything can have changed. So the point is, it can happen that fast. We've all known kids, and if we kind of just stick with this illustration and with this time in their life, we've all seen kids, even from this congregation, who would graduate in May and spend the summer, and you would think, man, they're doing great. They're going to be great. And then they move off and they go somewhere to college, and what happens? Sometimes the change happens really fast. Sometimes it takes a semester or two, but lo and behold, it feels like before you know it, what's taken place? They've fallen away. It can happen that fast. And it's not just to speak of someone who's in high school and then makes a transition to college. That one's just one that's really knowable to us. It can happen with who? It can happen with anyone. Those of us who are older in our lives, how can that transition affect, or how can that transition play out in our lives if we're not careful? Can happen when people... Yeah, it can happen when you change jobs or when kids leave. It can also happen when parents die. Have you ever seen families that seem so well, they're so strong, they feel like they're so well put together, and then the parents die, which technically at this point could be grandparents or even great-grandparents, but both of them are gone, and what happens to the family? As far as spiritually speaking, it just disappears. It's just gone. 5 years prior to that, when grandma and grandpa, or great-grandma and great-grandpa are still alive, you would think it's going to be fantastic. But that event, those two people passing, the matriarch and the patriarch of the family, and all of a sudden, it's all over with. A marriage that breaks apart. And suddenly you don't just lose... Number one, you don't come out of it unscathed. You not only lose one of them, you could end up losing both of them. And I'll promise you this, if you lose mom and dad, guess who else you're going to lose? The children. If you lose mom and dad to the world because of something that's so difficult to go through, like a divorce, you're probably going to lose the children as well. 5 years prior to that, everything could have what? Been good. Everything could have looked great. They're coming in and you just have no indication anything is wrong. And then all of a sudden everything changes. Someone can go to the doctor and get a diagnosis of cancer. And again, I don't bring these up because they're just pie in the sky. I don't bring these up because they just remind me of something. I bring these up because I've seen every one of them happen. They get a diagnosis of an illness, possibly even a terminal illness, and they don't what? Spiritually, they don't make it. They can't endure to the end. They can't withstand all of the pressures and the difficulties that come from life. So I'm sitting here thinking this past week, well, it's commitment. We all know about commitment, which actually is probably true. But knowing about commitment and making it through all of the things that the devil is going to throw at you is a completely different thing. If you would have asked me when I was 25 and I first started preaching, and I would have read a passage like Ephesians chapter 6. Go back with me to Ephesians chapter 6. To Ephesians chapter 6, and someone read verse 11. Someone read verse 11. And then read verse 16. So I could have looked in verse 11, the wiles and the schemes. I could have looked in verse 16 about the fiery darts. And, when I was a young man, you could have told me, yeah, I know. But now, I've seen all of them played out. And these fiery darts are really, really good. So knowing about commitment and encouraging people constantly to commitment are two very different things. And not surprisingly, we have to encourage people to commitment. We should be encouraging people to commitment. In fact, if we aren't encouraging people to commitment, we're falling down on our jobs. It's unbelievable what the devil throws at people. And everything can change so fast. And you see that with Demas. I think about just in let's close the lesson off with Abraham and Sarah. Look in Hebrews chapter 11 and look in, I believe it's verse 15. Hebrews chapter 11 and look in, yes, someone read verse 15. Hebrews chapter 11, someone read verse 15 for us. So they what? They had opportunity to what? To return. God called them out. We bring them up as good examples. You know, why are people good examples? Why are Abraham and Sarah good examples? Why are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego good examples? Why is Joseph a good example? Why are people good examples? Because when the time came to make a choice, they what? They made the right one. And it's really intriguing about Hebrews chapter 11, verse 15, because as you go through that account, and that account is settling into your heart, you're thinking, God told them to get up and go, and they just went. And I can't believe that. That's really amazing. And you forget about the fact that they spent, remember, how long in Canaan? How long did they spend in Canaan? We made the remark, and I know it was one little factoid that we talked about at least a week ago, possibly 2 weeks ago, so it's going to be hard to remember. But when Abraham was buying the piece of property to bury Sarah, at that point, he had lived in the land 63 years. About 63 years. So we think about these people that God said, get up and leave, and they got up and they left, and we think, wow, that's unbelievable. I can't believe how much faith they had. But then remember, once they got up and once they left, they had to what? They had to stay there. Because verse 15 says they could have what? Could have went back. You were called out of the world. The gospel called you. You obeyed. You were baptized. And you fight. Maybe you fight every day. I hope not, because that would be a difficult way to live. But you fight a lot, having the fiery darts of Satan thrown at you. You could what? It's very feasible. You could what? You could go right back to where you came from. But you don't. And that's living as a stranger and an alien. And I think that's important. It's important for us to be reminded about. It's important for you to mention to your children. It's important for you to mention to your grandchildren, because there's some people in the room that are going to have grandchildren that they're going to be raising and teaching. Not raising. They're going to be helping to raise. They're going to certainly be an incredibly strong influence. And participate in the teaching of them in just the next few years. We do have to teach them about commitment. And all of these great people that we have in the Bible are great because when the time came, they made the right decision and they stuck with it. Some of them had to stick with it for decades, but they did it, and that's to their eternal glory. And if you can do it, it's going to be your eternal glory too. All right, let's move on to our next one then. Understanding that us being disciples means that we have influence. We are indeed salt and light. Okay, where does this occur in the New Testament? As you can see, I'm giving it away here. Where does this occur in the New Testament? In Matthew chapter 5. Okay. So that wouldn't tell someone who's unfamiliar with the New Testament much. So someone tell me again, where does this actually occur? In the Sermon on the Mount. So let's go one step, let's take one more step down the staircase. It's not only in the New Testament, it's not just in Matthew chapter 5, it's not just even in the Sermon on the Mount. But it sort of kind of forms maybe the conclusion of what part? The Beatitudes. Yes, the Beatitudes. And let's go back to these Beatitudes. What are the Beatitudes? What are the Beatitudes? How could you sum up the Beatitudes? Do what, Charles? Yeah, they're blessings of what? Yes, different characteristics that people who are, the Sermon on the Mount, while it's almost the first thing that you run into, it's the first big thing you run into in Matthew, in the Gospels as they open up, that Jesus is actually saying, that He's preaching and teaching. However, if you harmonize it, it wasn't the first thing that He taught. But it was actually a monumental part of what He taught, because He's trying to discuss, He's trying to get them to understand, what is it going to be like to be a citizen of the kingdom? So you're going to be blessed if you what? Okay, so starting in that second or in that third verse, you're going to be blessed if you're poor in spirit. You're going to be blessed if you're mourn. You're going to be blessed if you're meek. You're going to be blessed if you hunger and thirst for righteousness. You're going to be blessed in verse 9 if you're a peacemaker. But you'll also be blessed in 10, 11, and 12 if you what? If you are persecuted for righteousness' sake. In fact, people kind of go back and forth about, biblical scholars just like things to analyze and to analyze it very deeply. But when you look in 10 and 11, you've got two blessings, but both of those blessings address pretty much a single point. What single point is that? The idea of being persecuted. Now, if that being the case, it's the only subject that has two what? That has two blessings. That has two beatitudes. So, you're blessed if you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. You're blessed when people revile and persecute you, when they say all kinds of terrible things against you falsely. So, what is the conclusion in verse 12? What should you do? You should rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And it just feels like, and I'll go ahead and admit, it just feels like that the idea is kind of sort of being extended now. So you're going to be persecuted in 10, 11, and 12. So now in 13, 14, 15, and 16, here's a reminder. You are what? You are salt and you are light. While you are being persecuted, what do you need to remember? That you're the light of the world, as it were. You have power to do what? You have powers to set an example. We have the ability to be a positive influence in the world. Now, you look at Jesus, for example, in Mark chapter 2, let's just pick a couple of places, or just this one place actually, Mark chapter 2, and let's read verses 16 and 17. So Mark chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. And what does Mark chapter 2, verses 16 and 17 say? Okay, so here is Jesus. And, we ask the question, we're the salt of the earth, we're the light of the world. And what did Jesus do in that passage in Mark chapter 2? What was He doing with them? He was eating with them, and people didn't take too kindly to that. So there is an idea that is going around, it's gone around for a long, long time, that we don't need to be afraid to be around the publicans and the sinners. Is that true? That we shouldn't be fearful of being around publicans and sinners. Is that true? Right, we shouldn't be afraid to do it. In fact, we should be willing to what? to be around them, because in being around them, we have the opportunity to be, as we're talking about now, a good influence. But Jesus wasn't around people who were publicans and sinners just for the sake of being around them. Why was Jesus around them? Because he was trying to make them do better. See, sometimes that argument is used by people who would like to say that I can be friends with anyone. Well, technically that's the case, and that's the truth. I can be friends with anyone. But what do I need to recognize? Right. The person that I'm around is always going to what? It's always going to have some kind of influence on me. The person I'm around is always going to have an influence on me. I've got to remember that. So Jesus was around people who were, hard people to be around in society. But what was he doing with them? He was trying to get them to repent. He was trying to get them to be converted. So as I spend my time around people, what should I be doing? I should be letting my light shine. Now, here is, of course, talking about the principles are easy. What's difficult is actually doing what? Is now applying them. So now we get to talk about, can you guess what my next question is? How do I influence people? Okay, so by my actions. Now, and this is all kind of leading to the question of, if I'm around someone who is of the world, all of you guys, we're all around people of the world. You arguably, I'm not going to put up any defense of myself. You guys who are having to go out into the workplace around it a whole lot more than I am. No argument there. No trying to flex myself and make this better than it is. But you're around people who probably use some pretty rough language. You're around people that probably would come in like tomorrow, and what are they going to tell you about when you see them tomorrow? How drunk they got on the weekend. What else? They're going to be in sinful situations, and they're going to talk to you about how they're going to basically continue, or maybe even get into, if you understand what I mean, how they're going to maybe even get into a worse sinful situation. So the question is, how can I let my light shine? How can I let my light shine? So there are times when you can indeed directly talk to someone about the things that they're doing wrong. How many of you, don't have to show me your hands, but how many of you have, when you've been around people who just curse all of the time? How many of us have actually told them, hey, look, I don't talk like that. Would you mind? And people have understanding. They really will. There's a lot of people who will, but there's a lot of people who will have a respect about that. And I don't know why people have, people will learn that I'm a preacher and they'll say something and they'll be like, oh, I'm sorry, you're a preacher. Well, it's like, no, I'm a Christian. And that same respect should not just be for the violation of the conscience of someone who preaches. It should be the violation of the conscience of anyone who actually wants to live godly. But how many people have you been around who will actually modify their behavior once they figure out who you are? We've all been around people like that. So I know that I can directly talk to people about things that they need to do better, about changes that they need to make in their lives. What else can I do? What else can I do? If they'll do it, yes. Very good thing if they'll do it. Study with, that's what Brenda said. Other suggestions? Yeah, and that kind of goes, sometimes you're around people and they're of the sort that you think, well, they'll never come. And it may be that you would give up on them because maybe they are in a good spot of wrongdoing. But it may be someone who just feels like they're extremely religious. Maybe they're extremely devoted to where they're going, and you would think, well, they're never going to come anyway. But it actually sometimes surprises you a whole lot that they at least give the gospel a chance. What else can we do? How else can I be salt and light? Has anything happened in anyone's life where you've been able to have a good influence in any way other than what we've already brought up? You know, and if so, what have you done? I'll tell you something that I've done. James is just talking about spending more time with him, which is actually really good because, of course, what's the problem with the workplace? Do what now? Well, yes, that's true. And what else is the problem with the workplace? Your employer probably isn't going to encourage it. Why? Because they're godless heathens? No. Why? That's an interesting way to put it. It interrupts productivity because it gets everybody in a what? In a snit. So let me just give you, and it feels so unfair, but I'll just tell you about a life experience that I had that was very frustrating while I was working full time and being a preacher. So I would talk to people at work, and it went exactly the way you thought it would go. And maybe I didn't answer everything. Maybe I didn't handle myself. So could there have been fault on my end? Yes, I fully accept that. But it got to where we were just kind of arguing and stuff. And so finally the employer, and it was a really small business. There were like 15 of them. So finally the employer said, look, we're not going to do it. Let's just stop talking about religion. Everybody's getting all mad about it. Let's switch to politics instead. Anyway, he said, let's just not do it anymore. So we didn't. Yet they continued to have Beer Friday. So Friday, about 4:30 before we all left at 5, everything would get all cleaned up, tidied up, all of your calls would be finished up, being made, and you're leaving for the weekend. And they would have Beer Friday. And then sometimes I would sit and watch as some of them in the plant would drive across the street. I think I've told you guys this before. They would drive across the street into a church building parking lot, and guess what they would do there? Guess what they would do there? They would buy marijuana. Because we knew that's what the guy was selling. We knew it. And we could watch car after car. There'd be 3 or 4 regulars from work who would drive across the street into the parking lot, pull up window to window, spend about 30 seconds, and then drive off. Just one after the other after the other. So if you ever see activity like that, I'm going to tell you what is taking place. It's a drug deal that's going down. But I couldn't talk about religion because that would be disruptive. But all of the other stuff could go on. Now, someone could easily say, well, why even bother with it? I mean, just throw up your hands and not worry about it. Just keep your mouth shut and not worry about it anymore. Well, Jesus said that I need to be what? I need to be salt and light. And sometimes being salt and light is not going to be easy. Sometimes when you back up into that 10th, 11th, and 12th verse, being salt and light sometimes is going to be what? It's going to be what, James? Yeah, it's going to be painful. Sometimes it's going to hurt. But if you do it, you are what? You are blessed. If you do it, you are blessed. So living as a disciple is living in a way that's going to help people be blessed by your presence. So, we're salt and light. Let's kind of pull apart what salt and light does. First of all, salt preserves. There's a lot of people, when you look at what people have written, and I guess if we still thought about things in reams of paper, there have been ream after ream after ream written about what is the meaning between salt and light. Most scholars think that the main idea about salt is its preservative nature. In saying that, it doesn't mean that it can cut out some secondary ideas about salt, which we're going to explore. But the main issue with salt, what does it do? It preserves. So how can I be a preservative factor? How can I be a preservative influence? When I oppose evil in whatever way that I choose to do it, different people, different circumstances, different choices to be made, but when I oppose evil in some way, shape, or form, what am I doing? Yeah, I am preserving God's truth. And if you guys can actually convince people, you are indeed preserving what? It's very lofty terms, but it's still true. You're preserving humanity from the decaying influence of sin. That's what's at stake. That's how important that it can be when you're salt in a preservative sense, in a preservative fashion. And think about this. If you think, well, boy, that's pretty, that's kind of pretty pie in the sky. Think about this. Abraham, again, bringing up Abraham a little bit later in his life, before he went into Canaan, Sodom and Gomorrah. God was willing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if He only found how many people? If He could have only found 10 people, what would God have done? He would have spared them. Judah, the southern nation of Judah. We'll talk a little bit about that in the men's class tonight. The whole southern nation of Judah was preserved by a good king. And I've said before, I think you can make the case, a reasonably good case, that this was the best of all of the kings of Judah by Josiah. So Judah is preserved by Josiah. Interestingly, they were sunk by one person. Because we had Hezekiah. Was he good or bad? Hezekiah was a good king. And then came his son. Who? Manasseh. And then came his son, who was Ammon. Then came his son, who was Josiah. And when you look back at why Judah was taken into captivity, why were they taken into captivity? Because of idolatry. But you know that idolatry, and I believe that this is generally stated, but it wasn't exclusively true. Do you know who they attributed that idolatry to? Do you remember who they attributed that idolatry to? Manasseh. Did it exist before Manasseh? It did. We know that it did. But his influence in dragging them further into idolatry was so strong that when the writers of history look backwards at how bad he was kind of the single-handed influence that drove them into captivity. And it almost worked because Josiah came along. And as bad as Manasseh was, Josiah was the complete opposite. And I'll tell you what, he almost saved those people. What was the real problem when Josiah came along? Why couldn't Josiah save them? And of course, we won't talk about the whole plan of God, but why was Josiah not able to save them? you've got good people, good kings that come along and influence the people for good, but they only last so long. And after their deaths, then likely you are going to receive more bad kings. And those bad kings, the 4 that were left after Josiah, made some really bad decisions and then brought the people into captivity. Josiah almost single-handedly he did save them from being taken away in his generation, but he didn't save them for good. But nevertheless, he was able to save people. In Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 1, have you ever seen this? Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 1. Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 1. Go to Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 1 and scan it for me and tell me what was needed. What was God looking for? Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 1. What was God looking for? Jeremiah 5 verse 1. Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem could have been saved. God was looking for what? One man. One man who would what? And you think, really? That you couldn't find... But think about Sodom and Gomorrah. They couldn't find what? They couldn't find 10 people. You could extend it one more step in Ezekiel chapter 22. It's the same idea. It's expressed differently. Ezekiel was writing from God, God's appeal. He was looking for one man who would stand in the gap, and it couldn't be found. So all of that is... Yes, that's very negative and that's very heavy. So all I want you to do as we kind of bring this to an end is think about it in the reverse. Look what good could have been done if it weren't for just one good person. I'll say it again because it's worth repeating. All of you guys who are in the education system, how do our kids look today? How do our kids look today? All of you guys who are in the education system. Because there's a bunch of them. Come on, I know there's 4 or 5 of them in the room. How do the kids look in the education system? One word. This is my word, by the way. You can disagree. I'm okay. My one word, troubled. 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 So, who gets to stand in the gap every day? Technically speaking, 187 days a year. I think that's how long Jenny's contract is. Does that sound right, Laura? You'd probably know. 187 days. Who gets to stand in that gap? About 4 or 5 of you guys in the room. And what can you be to all of these young minds? And it's more than just the mind, because these kids go home and some of them are in absolutely deplorable conditions. And I don't just mean like dirt. I mean deplorable in the way that they're treated and what they've got to put up with. But you guys are the ones who get to stand in the gap every day, 187 days a year, to be those kinds of representatives of righteousness and truth and godliness that maybe a kid couldn't see for years after all of this. So you need to think about it. Yes, Jared?
When I was growing up, everybody, almost all families went to church. You know, I'm not saying they were going to the church of Christ, but they went to church. They don't do that now.
Right.
Their parents work 2 jobs. Their parents have a job. Each one has a job, so there's nobody at home to supervise. So our nation has gone hot.
Yeah, and let me make this one more point, and it's a controversial point, but I've made it before and you guys haven't complained, so give me one more second. People can go to church. Pick anyone you want. The gospel is so powerful that people can sit in a place of error and it'll still do what to their lives? It'll still make it better. I'm not saying, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it will get them to heaven, but it can still make their physical life good. That, to me, I look at that as that's how powerful what the word that God's word actually is. You can still misuse it, and it ends up helping you. And I wish that more people could at least do that, could at least have their minds and hearts open to that. We will continue along with what salt is, and then we'll get into what light is next time.